Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Injustice: Gods Among Us for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PS Vita, Wii U, as well as a separate version of the game for iOS and Android that isn't really the same game. This is a fighting game developed by NetherRealm Studios and published by Warner Bros. In April of last year. It later saw a re-release as the Ultimate Edition, which is what you're seeing in this video, and that version was released on the original systems, of course, but also for PC, PS4, and PS Vita. The iOS and Android versions of the game have little to nothing to do with this game. They're really just side things that are certainly tied in with this thing, but I haven't played them, I don't plan on playing them, and I can't really speak for them, other than just knowing what they are, which is basically just companion apps. But the real question here is, did NetherRealm rest on their laurels after Mortal Kombat 9 and just slack off with this one, or did they deliver another really high quality product and bring DC into the limelight with a proper, solid fighting game? Because let's face it, this would be pretty easy to screw up considering you have the likes of Superman fighting against, well, all sorts of different characters. And a lot of these characters are certainly not as popular in the DC lineup. Did they do it all justice? And how is this game overall? Does it live up to the NetherRealm legacy after Mortal Kombat 9? Well, let's find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it does run on Unreal Engine 3, and it looks pretty solid for that. About what you would expect from your typical high-budget console game. And it looks quite nice in terms of its visual quality. You got a lot of pretty solid texture work. Animations are generally pretty smooth and fluid and work rather well. The environments are pretty well detailed, and you do get a lot of really nice effects going on. That said, I don't like the art style. I really don't. For certain characters, it looks fine. For example, Batman, Superman look fine. But for others, namely the female characters, not so much. Especially Raven and Wonder Woman. They look downright awful. They just have really bizarre facial structures, and they went with these weird looks that I'm just not a fan of. They do have alternate costumes available, but they still just look odd and just not how I expected after the comics and whatever shows they might have been in and such like that. That said, it is nice to see a lot of the slightly more obscure DC characters actually put into a fairly mainstream video game, and rendered quite well for the most part. They've done a very good job not only with making sure that these characters at least look mostly like they should, but also doing well in the sound department with them. By and large, the voice acting in this game is very, very well done. You'll hear a lot of very familiar voices if you've been a fan of the DC Universe animated stuff fairly recently. And they've done a very good job of getting the cast together and getting them working quite well. That said, they do a lot of repeats of various lines. For example, Batman says, "Stay down," a lot. A lot. And you only have one victory quote, basically, so that gets pretty tiresome after a while, but the voice acting itself works quite well. The sound effects are also very, very well done. They're very nice, hard-hitting sound effects when you're smashing these people around through buildings and flinging objects from the environment at them, smashing them into cars, all sorts of things like that. It really sounds visceral and punchy and hard-hitting. It's just awesome. The music is pretty well done for the most part. It's fairly standard superhero-sounding music, and it works fine, but they could have done a bit better with it. Make it more memorable. But as it stands, it just sounds kind of generic. But that's really the only major blemish on the sound design overall, apart from just some odd direction with certain characters here and there. And that ties in pretty heavily with some of the art design as well, so I don't know what they were going for with certain characters here and there, but by and large, it works fine, except for in those few cases where it doesn't work quite as well. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that in an alternate reality, Superman has been tricked into killing Lois Lane and his son, and the Joker managed to actually destroy Metropolis, which killed millions. This in turn caused Superman to go completely crazy, and he ended up murdering the Joker and instituting his own regime on the world. And so he now basically rules the world with an iron fist in an oppressive regime. And our heroes find themselves teleported to this reality when the Joker is trying to do a fairly similar thing back in their own reality, only he doesn't manage to succeed there. So you get into the actual plot, and you're playing as various characters throughout the course of the game. All these characters are aligned with the forces going against Superman's regime, and honestly the plot ends up being pretty ridiculous. You go through and none of it is really believable, even for a superhero story. And even for an alternate reality story, it doesn't really hold up all that well. So the plot isn't really all that enthralling, but it is nice to be able to play as all these different characters throughout the course of the game to give you a taste of how each of the characters plays. Of course, a lot of the fights are kind of contrived and just seem to be thrown in there just for the sake of throwing them in there, but oh well. So what about the rest of the game? The gameplay is what really matters here. It is a fighting game after all. And even though the plot in the game isn't particularly great, the story mode is certainly fairly solid. And of course, if you've played Mortal Kombat 9, then the story mode is going to be pretty familiar to you. It's basically just playing through the game as a bunch of different characters of the game's choosing. It gives them to you at the start of various chapters, and you play as that character for a few fights, then you move on to a new character, and so on and so forth. There's also the variety of modes available to you through the single player, where you have things like the classic battles, which is your basic arcade ladder, as well as a variety of other ladders, such as heroes only or villains only, where you're fighting only villains or fighting only heroes, so on and so forth. Lots of different conditions. Some of them have you starting with only half of a health bar, some of them have you going through a series of the arcade ladder, for example, but with only one health bar, the one you get at the very, very first match, and it's persistent throughout the matches. Things like that. So those do shake up the game and make them quite interesting. And there's also the Star Labs in the single player part, where you can go through a series of challenges. Granted, I'm not a big fan of these challenges, but they certainly have their place if you're looking for something that's a bit different from your typical fighting game experience. They're basically the same as the challenges from Mortal Kombat 9, where it gives you some weird conditions that you had to fulfill, some mini games that are just unusual, that sort of thing. And of course, there's always your basic two-player versus on the same machine with two controllers and such like that, as well as the online mode, where you can square off against other players through the ladder system that they've got set up on there, which is kind of awkward to navigate, but it does work, and unfortunately it's extremely laggy, to the point where it's practically unplayable. In fact, I did try playing this online, and I got more success with it than I did with Mortal Kombat 9. It's really, really laggy, to the point where I was seeing delays of at least 1.5 seconds between when I pushed the button and when something happened. Now, it didn't happen all the time. Usually the delay was only about a second, but that's way too much. You can't really play like that. And so I was trying to chain combos together, for example, and they just wouldn't trigger because it wasn't registering my hits properly. That just doesn't work. Now, it could have just been my connection with the person I was playing against. It is on a peer-to-peer system rather than dedicated servers, so that is entirely possible. But I didn't have any luck with it. Other people may report different experiences with it. There isn't that big of a player base on PC for the online functionality anyway, but you can pretty much expect the same kind of stuff that you saw in Mortal Kombat 9. There's a variety of modes available, and they're a different spin on fighting gameplay than what you're used to with a lot of your more traditional games, where it's just your basic fighting. Where this one they have things like the King of the Hill style mode, where someone becomes the king of the room and then you have to knock them off and such like that. But there's one thing that is conspicuously lacking, very conspicuously lacking, and that's tag team. It's a superhero game. You just blatantly expect to be able to team up. You expect to be able to do Batman and Robin. You expect to be able to do, say, the Titans. Get Nightwing, Raven, and Cyborg together, for example. But the game doesn't let you do that. It's only one-on-one fighting. Now, having played the game, I understand why they did that. It's the way they've set up the health. You actually don't have rounds in this game. You have health bars. There's 2 health bars per character. You have a silver one and a red one. Once the silver one depletes, you go to the red one. Now, these health bars are persistent throughout the match. So, for example, you take down the enemy's silver health bar to about half, and then they take yours down all the way. Well, now you're on your red bar, but they're still on half of their silver bar. And you can see that in the gameplay I'm showing. So, it's an interesting way of doing the fighting, but at the same time, it kind of rendered the idea of tag team ineffective, because you'd have these 2 health bars for every character, or it would only be 1 health bar per character. It'd be a weird situation. And the game is very clearly designed around these quick fire matches where you deplete the enemy's health bar very quickly, and at least you hope you do, and it just keeps the action going because there's barely any time between the so-called rounds. In something like Mortal Kombat 9, for example, you would deplete the enemy's health bar, you would do your little celebration, it would then make the guy get back up, it goes, round 2, fight. Well, here that doesn't happen. You just do your little victory celebration, and then they just get right back up and you go back into the action without any announcer doing anything other than saying, begin, at the very beginning of the match. So, it's a cool way of doing it, but at the same time, it just seems odd that they would go for something like this and then remove the ability to do tag team in a superhero game where that just screams out for some sort of tag team match. But they don't have it. It's only one-on-one. So, that also begs the question, how's the fighting itself? Does this kind of make up for this glaring omission? Well, yes, actually. The fighting in this game is very, very smooth. It's very fast-paced. You have a surprising amount of variety between all the characters, and there's a pretty full roster here. As I've mentioned, a lot of the characters are from the DC universe that you're not really used to seeing. Characters like Shazam, also known as Captain Marvel, or Raven, or Cyborg. All these characters who do show up in DC Universe stuff, but not so much in the mainstream. In the mainstream, you usually see the usual Superman, Batman, the characters associated with them. More recently, you've seen the Green Arrow on TV, or the Flash. And all of these old standbys are here. But you're also seeing some lesser-known characters, like Shazam, who is also known as Captain Marvel. He's not really a lesser-known character, but he's more underutilized. You have the Titans in here, at least 3 of them, and you have the associated villains with a lot of these various characters. And then, of course, there's Scorpion, because why not? It's a game by NetherRealm Studios. They're perfectly capable of putting whoever they want in here, and Scorpion's their guest character. He's also kind of overpowered, but that's beside the point. And each of the characters does have their own unique playstyle. Some of them rely very heavily on their powers. Some of them just rely on brute force. Each of them has not only the usual combos, the usual special moves, like some of them have just plain projectiles, others have other kinds of things. But they can chain all of these moves together quite well. And once you learn how all of the moves work really well, you're seeing very, very large combos for massive amounts of damage. And for certain characters, it gets pretty ridiculous, like, say, Batgirl. If you see any of her at high level play, it is ridiculous. But that's beside the point. These are superhero characters and supervillains. You expect them to just wreak havoc. And that's exactly what happens here. Injustice introduces a couple of things to differentiate itself from Mortal Kombat 9. First off, there's no fatalities or other finishing moves. That's to be expected. It introduces super moves, which are sort of like the X-ray move from Mortal Kombat 9, only there's no X-rays, and it's this ridiculously over-the-top super move where, for example, with certain characters, they'll punch them through the atmosphere and then punch them back down into the earth through the atmosphere again, or things like that. So some of those are incredibly satisfying to pull off, and they do a very large amount of damage. And then, of course, there's the things that do actually differentiate it, like the special button. Each character has a unique special ability, where it's just something that that character specifically has, and it affects them differently than similar powers might affect other characters. For example, if you press the button, Batman summons 3 floating bat devices. I can't remember what the name of them is. And then you can either use them as projectiles or use them as shields or something like that. And so that opens up some different possibilities. Superman has your basic buff power, where for a limited amount of time, he just does more damage, he's more ferocious, that sort of thing. And other characters have similar powers, but, for example, with Raven, she has something like that, where she does do a bit more damage when she uses her demonic powers, but now she has access to a few different moves than she did before. So they do quite a bit to differentiate the characters from each other, even if they have somewhat similar playstyles. And so there's a lot of room for picking up on a certain character and being like, well, I like this character, I'm going to stick with them. But hey, there's these other characters that I'm perfectly willing to play if I don't feel like playing my main character, because they're fairly easy to pick up, and even though I haven't really mastered them, I can certainly hold my own. And that's pretty much how you feel with all of the characters in this game. Although some of them are easier to play than others, and some of them are outright rather hard to master, because they might just have certain chains that you have to do in order to really be successful with them. And so you do find that there is some room for skill here. In fact, there's quite a lot of room for skill here, and it's very easy to get your ass handed to you if you don't know what you're doing. And a lot of this comes from the actual way the game plays out. Obviously, you have your basic fighting mechanics, but in Injustice, they decided to make the environment your weapon as well. On each of the stages, you have not only stage transitions, which you'll be seeing some of in this video, but also various items in the stages that you can use to defeat your enemies. You might pick up a large rock and fling it at your opponent for very, very large amounts of damage. Or you might, say, throw a car at them, or drive a motorcycle into them. Or just simply use a piece of scenery as a springboard to leap off of and get behind your enemy in order to just wail on them from behind, where they're pretty much helpless. And so that adds a layer of complexity to the gameplay that isn't quite there in Mortal Kombat 9, although it does make the game a bit more opportunistic, where if you really want to do a large amount of damage really quickly, it's very easy to just grab a piece of the scenery and fling it at your opponent or something like that. So that can get annoying sometimes, but let's face it, something like a stage transition is incredibly satisfying to pull off, and picking up a large boulder, for example, and throwing it at somebody to see half their health bar go away from it is also incredibly satisfying. So you have all of these different things blending together. with some already solid fighting mechanics that feel like they're right out of Mortal Kombat 9, but just a bit different. They're a bit more casual. They are easier to pick up and play with because you don't have that dimension of having a block button as well as having an extra attack button, for example. And so it's easier to memorize certain combos. It's easier to just get into a rhythm of play. But there's still a pretty high skill ceiling, and you can certainly find some very high level players who just know what they're doing and will just absolutely destroy you. And high level play is also very, very interesting to watch because of all this crazy stuff you can actually do. And of course, there's also this dimension of the superhero side of things. Things get pretty ridiculous, obviously, with the environments going crazy. But you also have things like the Clash, where you can wager some of or all of your super bar in order to win or lose the Clash. If you manage to put in more than the enemy did, then you win the Clash. If you manage to put it in less than they did, you lose. And if you put in the exact same amount, then you tie and nothing happens. If you win, depending on whether you're the attacker or the defender, you will either do damage, or you'll regenerate health, or neither will happen because you'll be on the other side of things. So that adds some interesting bits to the gameplay where there's this element of risk. Do you want to use all of your super bar for that super powerful super move, or do you want to gradually burn it over time using your various abilities to better effect? Because you can do just the same thing as you did in Mortal Kombat 9, where you do a meter burn. Or do you want to save it up for the Clash? Because you just know that this guy's going to do a Clash at some point. There's no way he couldn't do one, because, say, his health is really low and he really does need to actually pull off a Clash in order to get that health boost. Do you want to save that? Adds a dimension of strategy to the game. And it certainly feels very superhero-esque because when they do the Clash, they each utter a quote before charging at each other and having this really big explosion when they hit. And I do have to say that that's really the biggest strength of Injustice, is just how well they nailed the superhero fighting feel. It really does feel like these superheroes just bashing the living crap out of each other. You're seeing them rip the environment apart, smashing each other to bits. You're seeing them take damage over time. You're actually seeing, just say, muscles get kind of exposed. You're seeing their clothing get torn, they're bleeding, that sort of thing. And you're just doing these ridiculously over-the-top super moves, for example. It all blends together to make this absolutely great superhero feel, and you really do feel like this kind of clash of the titans sometimes. And it all blends together to make a very, very fun fighting game, even though it does have problems. The glaring omission of the tag team mode is just mind-boggling. You would think they would have thought of throwing that in there, but apparently they didn't. The online component is messy, so that does limit your playability quite a bit. But if you're looking for a really solid fighting game, Injustice is definitely a very solid fighting game. Is it as good as Mortal Kombat 9? Yes and no. In some ways it's better, in some ways it's weaker. It's actually just a different fighting game. It is fair to compare the two, don't get me wrong, because they do share quite a few similarities. But at the same time, they should each be taken as their own individual things. Mortal Kombat is its own series, Injustice is its own series. Hopefully. It'd certainly be nice to see a sequel to this that improves upon the things that it didn't do quite as well, and actually expands upon things. Maybe a tag team mode, for example. Maybe improving the online component. Who knows? But it's just really nice to have a good superhero fighting game. There's really no better way to put it. If you like superheroes and you like fighting games, you'll like Injustice. And if you're looking to get into fighting games and you like superheroes, Injustice is a pretty decent spot to start. It does have some pretty solid tutorials to help you out as well. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.